past, and a number of his players who themselves went on to Hall of Fame careers, whether it was a Mike Gartner, Rod Langway, among others. Brian Murray largely responsible. Scott Stevens, another Hall of Famer who played for the Caps in the 1980s. Brian Murray largely responsible for really bringing out the best in a lot of those players just as they were each coming into their own.
Yeah, definitely. Can you lay out for us the career of Mike Gartner?
Yeah, Mike Gartner, again, a Hall of Famer. He would go on to score more than 700 goals in his career. And going backwards a little bit, if you will, here, I referenced Alex Ovechkin has all the offensive records now. Whose records did he break? He broke Peter Bondra's. Whose records, whose scoring records, whose team records did Peter Bondra break? It was Mike Gartner. Mike Gartner was really the face of the franchise for large stretches in the 1980s. Certainly the offensive leader, the offensive catalyst for those Capitals teams, and a guy who was one of the first real superstars with the Washington Capitals. He was a first-round pick in 1979, and really when I reference the Capitals taking that next step in 1982-83 and going from that, expansion team that had a rough first 8 seasons to taking the next step and becoming a playoff team. Mike Gartner was among the offensive leaders, certainly a guy who could score goals at an incredible pace. He still holds the record today, the most 30-goal campaigns to start a career. He did so his first 15 NHL seasons. He was very consistent. He was a fixture in the lineup. He was an all-star. He even had a 50-goal campaign one year in the mid-1980s. And ultimately, for Mike Gartner, you kind of feel for him a little bit because by 1989, he had been with the team for 10 years, and the team was still trying to take that next step. What I mean by next step is they had established themselves as a playoff team. They had yet to make a deep postseason run, and he felt the team was on the cusp of doing so, perhaps reaching a conference final or even a Stanley Cup final, when at the 1989 trade deadline, he was dealt to the Minnesota North Stars, and it was a tough day for him, and ironically, he broke the news himself. This is, of course, pre-Twitter, pre-internet. He broke the news himself. He had a weekly segment on a local radio station here in Washington, and by coincidence, he was scheduled to do his weekly hit that afternoon, and he had just found out he had been traded a few minutes before that, and he went on the radio, and he broke the news to folks in Washington and any fans who may have been listening at the time, and he said, yeah, I've been traded to the Minnesota North Stars, and in a way, it was actually nice for him, he told me, because it allowed him, in a way, to thank the fans, and it allowed him to sort of end it on his own terms, just in terms of having the opportunity to publicly make some comments before moving on to Minnesota. But certainly one of 4 players to have his jerseys retired here in Washington, a legend in Mike Gartner.
Talking to Ben Raby, the author of 100 Things Capitals Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. And we'll go a little more recent now. Would you be able to describe to us the young and burgeoning career of Braden Holtby?
Yeah, Braden Holtby, it's interesting. He's emerged as certainly the undisputed number one in these parts, but arguably one of the best goaltenders in the world. The Vezina Trophy winner in 2016 is the top goalie in the NHL. But another guy, when we talk about everyone has their own unique path to the league, Braden Holtby was a 4th-round pick in 2008 from the Capitals. And going to sort of bring it back full circle here a little bit. We were talking earlier about Ole Kolzig, the franchise goalie in the late 90s and into the 2000s. Around 2005-06, the team recognized at some point they were going to have to move on from Ole Kolzig. He was getting up there in age already in his late 30s. So in 2006, the Capitals used their first 2 picks in the draft, a first-round pick and their second-round pick, on 2 young goalies, Semyon Varlamov and Michael Neuvert, and the thought was that one of those 2 goalies would emerge as the goaltender of the future in these parts. And then lo and behold, 2 years later, some folks were scratching their heads because 2 years later in 2008, they used a 4th-round pick on a Canadian goaltender named Braden Holtby. And it seemed at the time you had almost too many of these young goaltenders in the system, and it was curious to see who would ultimately emerge as the winner, if you will, in what was really a 3-horse race between Varlamov and Neuvert and Holtby to see who would emerge as the long-term number 1 goalie in Washington. And you have to figure, you had a first-round pick in Varlamov, you had a second-round pick in Neuvert, and then years later you had a 4th-round pick in Holtby. So the odds were, in a way, stacked against Braden Holtby. Not only was he a lower draft pick, but he was 2 years younger than Varlamov and Neuwirth. So in other words, they would always be 2 years ahead of him as far as the development went. But Braden Holtby, in speaking to him for this project, he acknowledged himself, you know what, better I go to a team that has all young goalies as opposed to going to a team where there was that bona fide, undisputed veteran number one in place. And he took it as a bit of a challenge to see, all right, what could we do? How could we get ahead of Varlamov and Neuwirth on the depth chart? And ultimately, it took time. It took years of seasoning in the minor leagues, but ultimately some injuries cost Varlamov and Neuwirth some playing time, and Braden Holtby all the while was doing his thing in the minor leagues. He emerged as an all-star in the ECHL and in the American Hockey League as well, and when the time came for him to reach the National Hockey League, he was ready, and he did, in fact, ultimately pass Varlamov and Neuwirth on the depth chart. They were both eventually traded to other teams, and Braden Holtby, you could almost say the rest is history, but a guy who certainly did it with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. He wanted to prove people wrong. He didn't think he should have ever been a fourth-round pick in 2008. He thought of himself a little bit higher. He acknowledged maybe not a first-rounder, but he said he believed he was going to be taken in the second or third round of that 2008 draft. And when he dropped to round 4 to the Washington Capitals after watching 9 goalies be selected before him in 2008, Braden Holtby acknowledged he had a lot to prove once he reached the NHL. And I think safe to say is he's now north of 200 career wins and the undisputed number one for a contender in Washington. He's done his fair share of proving folks wrong.
My nickname for him is Braden Holt Beast. Not Holtby.
That's right, he's the Holt Beast. That's right.
So staying in the recent years, what can you tell us about Nicklas Backstrom?
Yeah, Backstrom is the perfect complementary piece to Alex Ovechkin, and what I mean by that is Alex Ovechkin is the goal scorer, Nick Backstrom is the passer, is the distributor. Alex Ovechkin is the vibrant personality, never met a camera or microphone he didn't like. Nick Backstrom is a little bit more of the strong silent type, if you will, likes to do his work a little bit more in the shadows of others, and to that extent they've been the perfect complementary pieces for one another. Nick Backstrom, arguably one of the more underrated players, not only in Capitals history, but I'll make the case in the National Hockey League right now as far as present-day NHLers. I don't think Nicklas Backstrom gets the credit he deserves. His teammates certainly echo that thought. Part of that is because of his personality. He is such a quiet type of guy. He doesn't necessarily seek out the attention or the glory or the individual awards, but Nick Backstrom, who has to an extent been a part of the Capitals record book himself as far as most assists in franchise history and one of the best playmakers in Washington Capitals history. The timing of his career coinciding with Alex Ovechkin, as far as a 1-2 punch, you're not going to find better in Washington Capitals history, and I always tell people in this market, I hope folks don't take that for granted, what Ovechkin and Backstrom have been able to do as far as a tandem, the 1-2 punch. Ovechkin's approaching 600 career goals. He doesn't get half of those without a feed or an assist from Nick Backstrom, and certainly they've both benefited from each other throughout their careers, but Nick Backstrom, in an age where so often, right, you could have egos in sports and one player wants more attention than the other, Nick Backstrom has been the perfect ideal complementary piece over the last decade plus.
I'd agree with that 100%. Talking to Ben Raby, the author of 100 Things Capitals Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. And Ben, I'll get you out on this. Can you lay out for us the career of Bruce Boudreau?
Yeah, Bruce Boudreau, Gabby as they like to call him. He certainly likes to talk himself, Bruce Boudreau. He's one of the more colorful figures in the NHL. Just celebrated his 63rd birthday this week. And interesting, he's now on to his third NHL team with Washington, Anaheim, and now most recently behind the bench with the Minnesota Wild. But a guy who also paid his dues and waited a long time before getting the call in the NHL. He's been an NHL bench boss now for the last decade, but wasn't until 10 years ago, the 07-08 campaign, when the Capitals promoted him from AHL Hershey and gave him his first opportunity to coach in the National Hockey League. And at the time, just for context, it was Alex Ovechkin's third year. It was Nick Backstrom's rookie season. They had a few other young players on the team, Alexander Alexander Semin, Mike Green among them, future All-Stars. And the Capitals, at that point, they were still rebuilding, but the thought was they were ready to take that next step and become a playoff team. And that being said, they had a miserable start to the 07-08 season. They were in last place in the Eastern Conference by Thanksgiving. The coaching change was made. Bruce Boudreau came in, and perhaps working in Boudreau's advantage, he had coached a lot of the players in the minor leagues with the Hershey Bears over the previous few years. So he already had a little bit of a relationship with quite a few of the players inside the Capitals dressing room. It didn't take the team long to buy into what Bruce Boudreau was selling, and it didn't take long for the fan base to buy into it either. And what I'm getting at is Bruce Boudreau came to Washington, and he implemented a very exciting brand of hockey. It was like run-and-gun hockey. It was a lot of offense, not necessarily a lot of defense, not necessarily groomed for, deep postseason runs. Often defense wins championship, but certainly it led to a lot of regular season success. And kidding aside, it brought out the best in Ovechkin. It brought out the best in a rookie in Nick Backstrom. Mike Green on the back end emerged as an all-star defenseman, and he did so thanks to his use offensively. They were the running gun. They were the most exciting team on ice, as they called themselves, and they really were. It was really something to watch, and it really kicked off what would become known as the Rock the Red era in Washington, where the Capitals went from a rebuilding club into a perennial contender. I referenced earlier in the program, during the 1980s, they went through a similar transition where they went from a non-playoff team into a contender thanks to the work of Brian Murray behind the bench. Well, fast forward 25 years later, it was a very similar case in 07-08 when Bruce Boudreau came on board, and he took the team. He led them to 5 straight division titles, and he did so again with a very exciting brand of hockey, a high-scoring team, and some great memories produced along the way. They had a whole lot of regular season success. Again, it didn't always translate into the postseason, and that is why now, as the Capitals are in their 43rd NHL campaign, they are still looking for that elusive first Stanley Cup win.
All right, Ben, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, Jacob and Eleanor, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, that was Ben Raby. His book is 100 Things Capitals Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. Let's take a quick break, but don't go anywhere, because there's more of Beyond the Game coming up next on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. You're right, Past Jacob. There is more Beyond the Game coming up.
There it is.
Specifically, the bottom of the ninth. Yeah. Brandon, we'll start with you. Make it fast.
Playoff games this weekend, but I had a question that I put out on my Instagram and Twitter. Yeah. It's funny how, how radio personalities, your favorite ones, they say hit them up on their social media platforms and never respond. Is it me or is it them?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. I can't give you a straight answer.
I don't like that at all.
I'm sorry. Dominic?
Mine goes out to the NHL All-Star Game. Happy for John Tavares, Josh Bailey, and PK Subban and Taylor Hall.
Yeah, fair enough.
Those are my 2 favorite hockey
Your doppelganger.
players,
so. Eric?
All right, so the Blackhawks and the Coyotes made a trade, and the biggest name in this trade is Anthony Duclair, former Rangers top prospect and Coyotes player. His ceiling is a second-line forward, and I do think that this is a great move for the Blackhawks. You're getting a potential, honestly, all-star in Duclair, and I really like the move.
Really?
I agree with you. I think the Blackhawks won it handily. My dad turned 54 on Monday.
Happy birthday, sir.
So happy birthday, Dad.
Martin.
All right. Looks like you can call him that. I can't. I have to call him Daddy. Looks like we're about out of time here on Beyond the Game. For Brandon Johnson, Dominic Arbolino, and Eric Fischetti, I'm Jacob Valk saying I'm on a Mexican radio.